The desert had a way of pulling everything into silence. Not the peaceful kind. The heavy kind. The kind that settles on your shoulders and makes you aware of every breath you take. Late afternoon sun spilled across the dunes like molten copper, stretching long shadows over the sand as the wind nudged faint trails across the surface. The air shimmered with heat, and each gust carried with it the familiar scent of dust, sagebrush, and something faintly metallic, like a storm waiting to happen. Corporal Riley Maddox squinted against the light as he walked along the ridge, boots sinking with every step. His K9 partner, Hank, a strong, seasoned German shepherd with a black saddle marking and a stance that demanded respect, moved several paces ahead, nose low, tail stiff with focus. It was supposed to be a routine check. A simple afternoon sweep. Nothing out of the ordinary. But Hank's sudden shift in behavior broke the rhythm. The dog froze, completely. His ears pricked forward. His muscles tightened. A low, almost uncertain whine escaped his throat. Riley stopped. "What is it, buddy?" Hank didn't move. Didn't blink. He just stared at a patch of sand about 20 yards away, unmoving as if welded to the ground. That wasn't normal for Hank. Not for a dog who'd spent years reading the desert like a second language. Riley adjusted his grip on the leash and followed Hank's gaze. Nothing. Just wind, swept sand. No prints. No shifting colors. No signs of disturbances. Yet Hank wouldn't look away. "All right," Riley muttered under his breath. "Let's check it out." They moved closer. The heat radiated upward in visible waves, and the deeper Riley stepped, the heavier the air felt, as if the entire stretch of desert was holding its breath. When they reached the spot, Hank circled tightly, nose darting over the ground. Then he pawed at the sand, tentative at first, then harder, more urgently. His breathing quickened in short bursts. Riley's heartbeat picked up. "What are you finding?" Another paw swipe. Another. Then. Hank whimpered. Not the frustrated whine of a dog who'd lost a scent. A painful sound. A scared sound. Riley dropped to his knees instantly. He pushed his hand into the loose sand, letting the grains run through his fingers. Warmer than the surface. Softer. Disturbed. He dug deeper. A gust of wind swept across the ridge, sending a curtain of sand swirling around them. Riley shielded his face, coughed, and kept going. Hank's body pressed close, tail tucked, pacing nervously. Riley forced his hand further down. And touched something. Not rocks. Not roots. Something warm. Something that trembled. His heart lurched. He scooped more sand away, his hands clawing through the grains until the faint outline of a small form emerged. Fur, matted and dirty. Barely moving. Barely breathing. A puppy. Buried. Alive. Riley's breath stopped in his chest. Oh God. The tiny body shuddered under his touch, a weak, broken attempt to breathe. Its ribs showed through patches of thin fur. One paw twitched feebly, coated in dirt. The pup's face was half covered in sand, its nose clogged, eyes tightly shut. Hank pressed closer, whining anxiously as Riley cleared the last of the sand away and lifted the frail creature into his hands. It weighed almost nothing. "Hey, hey, stay with me," Riley whispered, voice shaking despite himself. "You're okay now. I've got you." The pup gave a faint, rattling gasp. Riley cradled the tiny body against his chest, shielding him from the wind. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization of how close this little life had come to disappearing forever. Hank nudged Riley's arm gently, as if urging him to hurry. "Yeah, bud," Riley murmured. "We're moving." Standing, he held the puppy close, scanning the empty horizons around him. No footprints. No tracks. No signs of anyone. Who would do this? How long had the little one been down there? How many breaths did he even have left? Riley didn't know. But he knew one thing. The puppy wouldn't die in this sand. Not today. Not while Riley and Hank were here. He turned toward the base, the sun blazing against his back as he moved quickly across the dunes, carrying a life that should have been gone, but wasn't. Because Hank had stopped. Because Riley had listened. Because something fragile, something tiny, something meant to be lost, had been found. And nothing about this day was going to be routine anymore. Riley moved as fast as the shifting sand allowed, holding the tiny pup against his chest with both hands while Hank kept pace at his side. The desert wind pushed against them, carrying gritty dust that clung to Riley's uniform and stung his eyes. But he didn't slow down, not for a second. Every shallow breath the puppy took felt like a ticking clock. "Stay with me, little one," Riley murmured, his voice low and steady even though his pulse pounded wildly in his ears. "You're not going anywhere. Not after we found you." Hank gave a short bark, urgent, anxious, as if echoing Riley's promise. By the time they reached the ATV parked near the trail, Riley could feel the pup's body trembling in uneven waves. He climbed onto the seat, cradling the little survivor in one arm and gripping the steering bar with the other. "Hang on," he whispered. The engine roared to life, shooting them forward in a burst of speed. Hank sprinted effortlessly beside the vehicle, matching its pace as if powered by pure determination. The base medical building came into view, a cluster of beige structures, antenna towers, and vehicles parked in uneven rows. Riley didn't ease up. He sped straight to the entrance, gravel spitting beneath the tires. He barely had the ATV stopped before he jumped off, rushing inside. The cool blast of air conditioning hit him first. Then the startled look of the on-duty medic, Staff Sergeant Dana Ruiz. "Corporal Maddox," she said, stepping forward. "What happened?" "Found him buried," Riley said, holding the pup up so she could see. "Alive." "Barely." Dana's eyes widened. "Set him on the table." She snapped into motion instantly, gloves on, equipment out, voice sharp and clear as she called for assistance. Riley placed the tiny dog down gently on the metal examination table. The pup's body looked painfully small against the cold surface. His breathing was faint, uneven, each inhale sounding like sand scraping through a narrow pipe. Dana listened to his chest, then grabbed an oxygen line. "He's severely dehydrated. Hypothermic. Oxygen-starved. And these rope burns." She lifted the pup's foreleg, revealing angry red marks. "Someone tied him up before burying him." Hank growled low under his breath, his hackles rising. Riley felt a cold, sick anger spread through his chest. Who would do this? "We'll worry about that later," Dana said firmly. "Right now, he needs stabilization." A second medic, Private Torres, rushed in with supplies. They worked quickly, oxygen mask, warm fluids, careful cleaning of the pup's face and nose. At one point, the tiny body went still enough that Riley held his breath, afraid the worst had happened. "Come on," he whispered, leaning closer. "Fight." The pup's chest rose again, small, shaky, but alive. Dana nodded. "Good. That's good. He's trying." For several minutes, the room was filled only with the sounds of machines beeping softly and the medics working swiftly. Riley stood at the edge of the table, hands curled into fists at his sides, feeling utterly helpless. Finally, Dana stepped back. "He's stable enough for transfer," she said. "Let's take him to the K-9 wing. They'll know what to do." Riley let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He gently scooped up the puppy again. The pup shifted weakly, pressing his head faintly against Riley's chest as if recognizing the one who pulled him from the sand. Riley's throat tightened. "You're okay," he murmured again, softer this time. "You're safe now." Hank walked beside him with quiet intensity as they made their way through the hallway toward the K-9 medical unit. They passed soldiers, handlers, and technicians, each one pausing to stare at the fragile creature Riley carried. What happened? Where did you find him? Is he going to make it? Riley didn't stop. He reached the K-9 wing and pushed through the glass doors. Inside, Dr. Elena Voss, a veterinarian with calm eyes and the posture of someone who'd seen more than she ever spoke about, turned toward him. What do we have? She asked. Riley lowered the puppy into her waiting arms. Buried. Deep. Barely breathing. Rope burns on all limbs. Elena's expression hardened with professional focus. Let's get him started. She disappeared into the treatment room, and for the first time since pulling the pup from the sand, Riley felt the weight of everything catch up to him. He sank into a chair along the wall. Hank sat at his feet, resting his chin on Riley's boot. Minutes passed. Then more. Every second felt like a battle fought in silence. Finally, Elena re-emerged. He's in critical condition, she said. But he's a fighter. Riley exhaled slowly. He'll need warmth, fluids, antibiotics, close monitoring, she continued. But he has a chance. Riley nodded, jaw tight with emotion he didn't allow to show. Can I stay? He asked. Elena gave a small smile. I assumed you would. Hank pressed closer, tail wagging once, just once, and Riley reached down to rest a hand on the dog's head. They had saved lives before. But this one felt different. Fragile. Meaningful. Unexpected. And it wasn't over yet. The hours that followed felt like an endless blur, soft lights, quiet footsteps, muted conversations, and the steady beeping of machines monitoring a life that hung by the thinnest thread. Riley stayed in the observation room, seated in one of the stiff metal chairs that always seemed too cold or too hard. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, staring through the glass window that separated him from the tiny puppy who was fighting to keep his heart beating. Hank lay stretched across the floor beside him, head resting on Riley's boot, ears flicking at every unfamiliar sound from the hallway. The older shepherd kept his gaze fixed on the room where the pup was, as though guarding him even from a distance. From inside the treatment area, Dr. Elena Voss and the veterinary technician team worked in low, steady voices. Whenever Riley leaned closer, he could hear snippets. Oxygen levels rising. Heart rate still shallow, keep monitoring. Warm him slowly. No sudden temperature changes. Tiny veins, go slow with the fluids. Each word felt like a small spark of hope pushing back against the fear pressing on Riley's chest. After nearly an hour, Elena finally stepped out of the room, pulling off her gloves as she approached Riley. He's stable enough for monitoring, she said gently. But he's far from out of danger. Riley straightened. What does he need? A lot, Elena replied. Warmth, rest, antibiotics, hydration, and time. His body has been through trauma we can't fully measure yet. But he's responding better than I expected. Riley nodded slowly, letting out a breath that shuddered on the way out. Can I? Elena gestured toward the kennel inside the treatment room. You can sit with him. Just don't touch him yet. His skin is still too fragile. Riley stood immediately. Hank rose with him, following closely until Elena held a hand out. He stays, she said kindly. Hank paused, then lowered himself back to the floor, watching with quiet resignation as Riley stepped inside. The room felt warmer than the hallway, intentionally so, filled with heated pads, warming lamps, and soft blankets. Tiny machines hummed softly. And in a small open incubator, wrapped in a thin cloth, lay the pup. He looked even smaller now that he was clean. His fur, once matted with sand, had been carefully wiped down. Under the warm light, Riley could see the fragile outline of his ribs and the delicate rise and fall of his chest. Riley approached slowly, lowering himself onto the floor near the incubator. He rested his arms on his knees and leaned close, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Hey there, little guy," he murmured. "You're safe now. No more sand. No more darkness." The pup didn't move much, but Riley saw the faintest shift of his paw, a tiny attempt to stretch toward the warmth. Elena watched quietly from the doorway, then stepped back out to give him space. For a long while, Riley just sat there, listening to the monitors, watching the rise and fall of the pup's tiny breaths, letting the quiet settle around him. Then the door opened again, and a familiar presence stepped inside. Sable. The tall, sharp-eyed German shepherd walked with quiet precision into the room. She moved like a soldier, calm, silent, aware of everything around her. She sniffed the air once, then padded over to the incubator and sat beside Riley. Riley raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess," she pushed the door open. From the hallway, Hank let out a single bark, annoyed, as if tattling. Elena reappeared in the doorway. "She's surprisingly persuasive," she admitted, hands on her hips. "And she made it very clear she wasn't leaving." Riley chuckled softly. Sable lowered her head and gazed at the puppy with an expression Riley had only seen her wear around the newest trainees, soft, protective, almost maternal. "She can stay," he said quietly. Elena nodded and stepped out again. For the next few minutes, the three of them stayed in silent vigil, Riley, Sable, and the tiny life in the incubator who had somehow become the center of their world. At one point, the puppy gave a faint whimper, a thin, fragile sound. Sable tilted her head, ears forward, her gaze sharpening with concern. Riley leaned closer. "It's all right," he whispered. "You're all right, little one." The pup's breathing eased again. A wave of emotion hit Riley then, a mixture of anger, confusion, heartbreak, and something else he couldn't fully name. "Who would bury a baby like you?" he whispered, voice cracking. "Who could do something like that?" Sable let out a low, soft sound, almost a sigh. Riley rubbed his palms together, staring at the tiny creature. "You should have died down there," he said quietly. "But you didn't." He looked over at Sable. "He didn't." Sable's tail flicked once, as if in agreement. Hours passed. Elena checked on the pup periodically, adjusting equipment, recording vitals, giving quiet updates. Sometimes the pup stirred. Sometimes he barely seemed to breathe at all. But he kept fighting. And Riley kept sitting. Until finally, Elena returned with a small, gentle smile. "You should get some air," she said softly. "Just for a minute." Riley looked at her, exhausted. "You won't miss anything," she assured him. "He's in stable hands." Riley let out a breath, nodded, and slowly pushed himself to his feet. Sable stood with him. Hank perked up in the hallway as Riley stepped out, then pressed his head against Riley's thigh in a rare display of worry. Riley rested a hand between Hank's ears. "He's hanging on," Riley said quietly. And for the first time since the desert, the knot of dread in his chest loosened, just a little. But they all knew this was only the beginning. The real fight hadn't even started yet. Riley stepped outside the clinic and was greeted by the crisp evening air settling over the base. The desert was cooling down, the harsh daytime heat fading into a calmer, more bearable warmth. Above him, the sky stretched endlessly, streaked with soft orange and lavender tones as the sun sank behind the distant ridge. He took a long breath, letting it fill his lungs, grounding himself. For the first time in hours, he allowed his shoulders to drop from the rigid tension that had locked them in place. Hank stayed close, brushing against Riley's leg, sensing his unspoken turmoil. The shepherd nuzzled his hand softly, a silent reassurance that he wasn't alone in carrying the weight of what had happened. Sable emerged a moment later from the clinic doors. She moved with her usual precision, steps measured and quiet as she sat beside Hank, her posture dignified and composed. Both dogs watched Riley closely. "You two are something else," Riley murmured, kneeling so he was level with them. Hank nudged his shoulder firmly while Sable leaned in, resting her head gently against his arm. Riley closed his eyes. He hadn't realized how desperately he needed this moment, this stillness, this grounding, this certainty that some things in his world still made sense. After a few minutes, the clinic doors swung open again. Elena leaned out. "Corporal. He's asking for you." Riley felt his heart jolt. He stood up immediately, wiping his palms on his uniform as he followed Elena inside. Hank and Sable padded behind him until Elena held out her hand. "Just you for now," she said. "He needs minimal stimulation." Riley nodded and stepped into the treatment room alone. The warmth inside was comforting, almost like stepping into a cocoon. Soft lights glowed around the incubator. Machines hummed their steady rhythms. And there, in the center of it all, the tiny puppy stirred. The little creature opened his eye, just one, the left one, the right still swollen shut, and tried to lift his head. His body trembled with the effort, but he managed a fraction of a movement before collapsing weakly back onto the blanket. Riley pulled up the small stool and sat close, bending down to meet the pup's line of sight. "Hey," he whispered. "Yeah, I'm right here." The puppy blinked at him slowly. His breaths were soft and uneven, but there was something unmistakable in the way he looked at Riley. Recognition. Faint, fragile, but real. Riley swallowed the tightness in his throat. "You're tougher than you look," he murmured. The pup's ear twitched. It was barely more than a flicker, but to Riley, it felt like a victory. Elena approached quietly from behind. "He responded when he heard your voice," she said. "That's a good sign. His system is still in shock, but he seems to be stabilizing." Riley didn't take his eyes off the tiny dog. "What are his chances?" Elena hesitated, a pause long enough to feel heavy. "We won't know until tomorrow," she admitted. "But he's fighting. And sometimes, that matters more than we can explain." Riley nodded, jaw tightening. "I want to stay with him." "I figured you would." Elena placed a folded blanket beside him. "You can sit as long as you need." She stepped away again, giving him space. The room felt quieter now, the hum of the machines blending into a steady background rhythm. Riley shifted slightly and rested his forearms on the edge of the incubator. For a long time, the two of them simply existed in the same small space, Riley breathing calmly, the puppy breathing raggedly, the air between them filled with something fragile yet undeniable. After several minutes, the pup made a small, trembling sound. Not a cry. Not a whimper. Something softer. Like a tiny sigh. Riley leaned closer, lowering his voice. "That's it," he whispered. "Just rest. You've done enough today." The pup's small body relaxed, the tension easing from his trembling limbs. His breathing steadied just a little, tiny, rhythmic breaths like the faint ticking of a very small clock. Riley felt something shift inside him. He'd saved lives before. He'd carried wounded soldiers out of burning vehicles. Held the hands of men in their final breaths. Seen enough pain to last a lifetime. But this tiny creature, this miracle buried in the sand, felt different. Maybe because this life had been thrown away. Maybe because someone tried to erase him from the world. Maybe because he wasn't supposed to be here, yet he was. And Riley wasn't about to let him slip away now. He reached into the incubator carefully, laying his hand flat so the pup could feel the warmth of his palm without being touched. Slowly, weakly, the puppy shifted his little head and rested it against Riley's fingertips. That single moment hit Riley harder than he expected. "Yeah," he whispered, voice thick. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Outside the room, Hank let out a low bark, curious, worried, hopeful. Inside the room, the tiny pup breathed on. Tonight would be long. And tomorrow would be harder. But for the first time since pulling him from the sand, Riley felt something steadying in his chest. The little one wasn't just surviving. He was choosing to stay. Night settled over the base like a heavy blanket, softening the sharp silhouettes of the buildings and painting everything in muted tones. The clinic's lights glowed warmly through the windows, casting long rectangles of gold across the gravel outside. Riley hadn't moved much at all. He sat beside the incubator, elbows resting on his knees, watching the tiny rise and fall of the puppy's chest, each breath small, uneven, but present. Every few minutes, a machine beeped softly, announcing a shift in vitals or a slight dip before stabilizing again. Hours earlier, the pup had seemed barely alive. Now, he was clinging on, still dangerously fragile, but clinging. Riley stayed because leaving felt unthinkable. Every time the little dog shuddered, Riley leaned in. Every time the breathing steadied, he let out a slow, relieved exhale. And every time the puppy whimpered softly, Riley whispered something soothing. "You're okay. I'm right here. Just rest. You made it this far. Keep going." Sable lay curled at the foot of the doorway, watching like a silent guardian. Her ears twitched whenever the machines beeped, and her eyes followed every shift in Riley's posture. She didn't whine or pace, she simply stayed, steady and calm. Hank was the opposite. He paced the hallway outside the glass doors for nearly an hour, unable to keep still. Every few minutes, he'd stop and stare through the window, tail tucked with worry, then resume moving again. Only when Riley finally stepped out for a moment to reassure him did Hank settle, leaning heavily against Riley's thigh. Now, Riley returned to the incubator and watched the tiny life resting inside. Elena entered again, carrying a small tray of syringes, warm saline, and nutritional supplements. She moved with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this countless times but still cared deeply about each patient. "How's he doing?" Riley asked, his voice hoarse from hours of whispering. Elena checked the monitors. "He's hanging on. You sitting here helps, you know." Riley frowned faintly. "You sure?" "Positive," she said. "He responds to your voice and your presence. Trauma this deep, they fight harder when they feel safe." Riley nodded slowly, glancing back at the tiny pup. Elena gave him a soft smile before returning to work. "We'll give him a bit more warmth support and another round of fluids. His sugar levels are still unstable." Riley leaned closer as she adjusted the small oxygen mask that covered the pup's nose and mouth. The puppy twitched weakly at her touch, then relaxed. "He's stronger than he looks," Elena added. "Some animals survive things we can't even imagine." Riley's jaw tightened. "He shouldn't have had to." "No," Elena agreed quietly. "He shouldn't have." When she stepped out of the room again, Riley placed his hand inside the incubator, flat, palm down, offering warmth without contact. The puppy shifted. A soft, shaky movement. Barely noticeable, but unmistakably intentional. He pressed his tiny head against Riley's palm. Riley froze, breath catching in his throat. "Hey," he whispered, emotion thickening his voice. "You're really trying, aren't you?" The pup gave a faint sound, a small whimper, but not fearful. It was almost as if he were answering. Riley swallowed hard, blinking away the burn in his eyes. It was the kind of moment that cracked something open inside him, something he hadn't realized he'd been holding closed since losing Tango and Blaze. Something tender. Something painful. Something hopeful. This little dog shouldn't have survived. Yet here he was. Fighting. Breathing. Choosing life. After another half hour, Riley finally rose and stepped into the hallway to stretch his legs. Sable stood immediately, brushing against him with quiet reassurance. Hank walked over and nudged Riley's hip, letting out a soft whine. "He's still with us," Riley said quietly, resting a hand between Hank's ears. "He's trying." Hank exhaled, a deep, shaky breath, almost human in its weight. Riley walked to the water fountain, splashed cold water on his face, and returned to the observation window. He watched the little pup from there, the glow of the incubator lighting the room like a tiny beacon in the dimness. Torres, the young medic from earlier, approached as he walked by, carrying a clipboard. "How's he doing?" the private asked softly. "Still fighting," Riley replied. "That's good." Torres hesitated. "If you need anything, sir, you just let me know. I've never seen a dog survive something like this." Riley nodded. "Me neither." Torres moved on, and Riley went back inside the treatment room. Night deepened around them. Shadows grew longer in the corners of the room. The machines kept humming, steady and faithful. And Riley sat again, close enough that the pup could sense him. The little dog slept fitfully, shifting slightly, breathing in short bursts, then settling again. Hours passed like this. Until, just past 2 a.m., something changed. The pup stirred more deliberately, lifting his head just a little, wobbling, trembling violently, and peeked toward the sound of Riley's voice as he whispered something unintelligible under his breath. The single open eye blinked once. Twice. Then the puppy attempted a small, broken sound. A soft, tiny whine. Riley leaned forward. "That's it," he whispered with a tremble in his voice. "I hear you. I'm right here." The pup's paw twitched against the blanket, trying to move, trying to reach. Trying to live. And for the first time since the desert, Riley allowed himself to hope without fear. The puppy was still in a battle he might not win. But he was no longer fighting it alone. Morning crept slowly across the base, its first rays sliding through the blinds of the clinic and casting pale stripes of light across the floor. The world outside was waking up, vehicles starting, boots crunching gravel, distant conversations drifting through the hallways, but inside the treatment room, everything felt suspended in a gentler rhythm. Riley had barely slept. Maybe 20 minutes total. He didn't care. He sat exactly where he'd been for hours, beside the incubator, one hand resting near the tiny puppy, offering warmth and presence without touch. At some point during the night, Sable had curled up by the doorway, her tail curled neatly around her legs. Hank lay stretched across the hall, chin on his paws, eyes half open, watching both Riley and the quiet bundle of fur in the incubator. When Elena entered the room just after sunrise, her steps softened at the sight. "You didn't leave," she said gently. Riley shook his head. "Couldn't." Elena checked the monitor, her brows lifting slightly. "His readings look steadier this morning." Riley exhaled slowly, a breath he'd clearly been holding for a long time. "Is that good?" "I mean, really good." "It's promising," she replied. "His heart rate is still weak, but more consistent. His temperature stabilized overnight. And," she inspected the 4-line. "He didn't crash. That alone is a huge victory." Riley looked at the puppy as if the tiny creature had just lifted a mountain. "Can I talk to him?" he asked, feeling oddly self-conscious. Elena smiled. "He knows your voice. It calms him." Riley leaned closer. "Good morning, little guy." The puppy twitched, just barely. His ear moved a fraction. A tiny response, but it was there. Elena made a note on her clipboard. "When he hears you, his vitals tick upward." Not dramatically, but enough to notice. Riley blinked. "Really? Really?" Hank barked once from the hallway as if verifying the information. Sable perked her ears but remained quietly dignified. Elena added, "He'll need more intensive care today, nutritional support, antibiotics, gentle handling, but he's showing signs of wanting to live." Riley swallowed the knot in his throat. "That's all I can ask." Elena paused, then said softly, "I've seen dogs come back from things that should have killed them. But this little one, he's different. He shouldn't have survived the night." Riley glanced at the pup, fragile, motionless except for slow breaths. "But he did," Riley whispered. He did, Elena echoed. Around mid-morning, Camila Rowe, the behavioral specialist, entered the clinic. Her hair was messy, as if she'd rushed out the door without finishing her morning routine. She held a small thermal blanket in her hands. "Where is he?" she asked breathlessly. Riley motioned toward the incubator. Camila approached, pressing one hand against her chest. "Sweet baby, oh, he's even smaller than they said." She placed the blanket beside Riley. "It's made to stay warm for hours. Thought he might need it." Riley offered a tired but sincere smile. "Thank you." Camila crouched beside him. "How's he doing?" "Holding on," Riley replied. "He's fighting." Camila wiped at her eyes. "Whoever buried him, whoever did that, I hope they never see the sun again." Riley didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The hard tension in his jaw said it all. Camila stayed only a moment before returning to her shift, but the quiet fury in her expression lingered long after she left. By noon, the clinic was steady with movement. Medics walked through hallways. Phones rang. Equipment rolled from room to room. But inside the treatment room, everything remained a quiet bubble. Riley rarely moved. He brought in a small stool to sit more comfortably, though his posture stayed tense, ready to respond to even the smallest change in the puppy's breathing. Hank and Sable had settled into their own rhythms, Hank lying across the doorway as though guarding entry, and Sable sitting upright like a disciplined sentry, her head occasionally lowering to rest near Riley's foot. At one point, Torres returned with a small bowl of warm broth. "Try offering him a bit," Elena said, placing the bowl on the counter. "Not too much. Just a dab on his tongue." Riley dipped his finger into the warm liquid and touched it gently to the pup's mouth. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, the puppy's tongue moved. A tiny flicker. A taste. A response. Riley's breath caught. He tried again. Another flick. A swallow. He could have collapsed with relief. Elena nodded. "That's a good sign. We'll keep building on that." Riley sat back, shoulders shaking as he let out a long exhale. "You're doing it," he whispered. "You're actually doing it." The pup made a soft, muffled noise, barely audible but filled with life. Later in the afternoon, Elena spoke quietly with Riley while adjusting the oxygen flow. "We should give him a name soon." Riley blinked, surprised. "A name?" "It helps," Elena said gently. "Names matter. They make us claim them. And right now, he needs someone to claim him." Riley looked down at the pup, feeling something warm bloom in his chest. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "That's all right," Elena said. "He'll tell you." Riley looked at her. "Tell me?" "You'll just know." Riley wasn't sure he believed that. But as he watched the tiny dog breathing under the warm light, something inside him shifted, like an invisible thread pulling tight. Maybe she was right. Maybe some names weren't decided. Maybe they were discovered. As evening settled over the base, the clinic lights dimmed slightly. The day had been long, emotionally draining, physically exhausting, but different from yesterday. There was progress now. Small, fragile, precious progress. The puppy's breaths were still uneven, still shallow, but stronger. His body no longer trembled constantly. He reacted when Riley spoke. He swallowed tiny drops of broth. He slept with less distress. Riley leaned forward again, resting his hand inside the incubator. As if sensing him, the pup shifted, just enough to press his face against Riley's palm. Riley's voice trembled. "You're something else, you know that." Hank huffed softly behind him. Sable lay down near the door, head resting on her paws, eyes half closed but watching both of them carefully. Riley stayed with the little dog long into the night, quiet, steady, undemanding. He didn't move until his legs were numb. He didn't speak unless the pup stirred. He didn't think about anything except the tiny life choosing again and again to stay. And sometime after midnight, as the desert air cooled and the clinic settled into silence, something happened that made Riley freeze. The puppy made a sound. Not a whimper. Not a cry. A tiny, shaky, breathy MMH. A noise of recognition. Of connection. Of life. Riley blinked hard, his chest tightening. "You hear me," he whispered. "You actually hear me." And the pup, so impossibly small, so close to death just hours ago, shifted again, pressing even more firmly against Riley's palm. As if answering. Morning settled gently over the clinic, soft and pale, filtering through the blinds in thin lines that crossed the floor like quiet invitations to breathe. Riley hadn't meant to fall asleep, but at some point during the night, exhaustion dragged him under. His head rested against the edge of the incubator, one hand still inside, palm open, offering warmth. And that was how Elena found him. She stepped into the room quietly, her footsteps soft so as not to wake the fragile life inside the incubator, or the exhausted marine leaning against it. A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Corporal," she whispered. Riley stirred slowly. His eyes blinked open, blurry from lack of sleep, and for a moment he looked disoriented, until he remembered exactly where he was. His gaze darted to the puppy. Still breathing. Still warm. Still fighting. Riley straightened slowly, rubbing the stiffness from his neck. "Sorry. I didn't mean to knock out." "You stayed all night," Elena said. "Your body finally demanded a break." Hank and Sable were curled against each other in the hallway, both awake but resting, both watching Riley as if checking that he was still whole. Elena checked the puppy's vitals, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to something softer. "He made it through the night again." She glanced at Riley. "That's two now." Riley let out a long breath he couldn't contain. "He's still with us." "He's a little miracle," Elena said. The puppy stirred faintly, his head nudging toward Riley's hand. His breaths weren't perfect, they were still uneven, still catching at times, but stronger than before. Riley leaned close. "Good morning, fighter." The pup blinked once, the faintest flutter of recognition. Later in the day, after fresh fluids and a warm compress session, the puppy managed something he hadn't done since the moment he was pulled from the sand. He opened his mouth. Just slightly. A tiny movement. Barely there. But enough for Elena to say, "He's trying to vocalize." Riley crouched close, hope sparking. "Yeah. What are you trying to say, little guy?" A small, raspy sound escaped, thin, scratchy, broken. But it was a sound. Sable perked her ears, tail tapping the ground once. Hank pushed forward, nose almost pressed to the glass of the incubator. This wasn't just noise, it was communication. The pup tried again, his tiny body trembling with the effort. Another sound. Barely audible. Like the faintest echo of a whine. Riley felt something swell in his chest, something warm, something he hadn't let himself feel for a long time. "It's okay," he murmured. "I hear you. Keep going." The puppy settled again, exhausted but safe, his tiny breaths fogging the inside of the incubator door. Elena stepped back, studying the pup with careful eyes. "These small milestones, they matter. They show us he's choosing life." Riley nodded. "He's got a lot to say, I think." "Most survivors do," Elena replied quietly. Around midday, the door swung open and Lieutenant Brianna Ellis stepped into the clinic. She was in uniform but carried the look of someone who'd run here without stopping. Her blonde hair was tied back messily, and she held a thermos of coffee and a small paper bag. "Update?" she asked. Riley gestured toward the incubator. "Still fighting." Brianna let out a breath of relief. "Good. Because half the base has been talking about him. She handed Riley the bag. Eat something, Maddox. Before you pass out again. I didn't pass out, Riley muttered. Hank barked once. Sable's tail flicked. Brianna smirked. Riley sighed. All right. Fine. Maybe a little. Brianna knelt beside the incubator, her expression softening as she saw the tiny pup. Unbelievable, she whispered. Something buried alive shouldn't have made it through a minute, let alone this long. Riley looked through the glass at the small, fragile creature. He had help. Hank puffed his chest. Sable looked smug. Brianna shook her head with a smile. Well, whatever you're all doing, keep doing it. By late afternoon, after the pup's vitals stabilized again, Elena allowed Riley to hold him for the very first time. Just for a moment, she said. And very carefully. Riley froze. Seriously? Elena nodded. He needs close warmth. And you're safe to him. Riley's hands shook as he reached into the incubator and gently scooped the puppy into his palms. The tiny body weighed almost nothing, feather-light, fragile, icy around the paws yet warmed by the blankets. The pup let out a soft, weak sound when lifted, then pressed himself instinctively against Riley's chest. Riley's breath hitched. His eyes stung. Hey, he whispered. I've got you. The puppy's breathing steadied, still shallow, but calmer. His little nose nudged against the fabric of Riley's shirt. One of his paws twitched, curling slightly against Riley's thumb. Sable stepped closer, ears perked like she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Hank moved behind Riley and rested his chin on Riley's shoulder, sniffing the tiny bundle carefully. Elena watched, her voice soft. He feels safe with you. Riley swallowed hard. Yeah. I feel that. He held the little dog for several minutes, letting his heartbeat create a steady rhythm the pup could lean into. The pup's breathing settled even more, his small body relaxing fully for the first time since the rescue. He trusts you, Elena said. Riley nodded slowly. I won't break that. When it was time to place the pup back into the incubator, the tiny creature whimpered softly, barely audible, but unmistakably in protest. Riley whispered, I'll be right here. And he stayed. Hours later, while the sun dipped behind the horizon and the clinic quieted into evening darkness, the little pup shifted in his sleep and made that tiny noise again. That breathy, fragile sound of connection. Riley leaned in, voice barely a whisper. Yeah, he murmured. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. For the first time since the rescue. Riley wasn't just hoping. He was believing. The following morning broke slow and warm, sunlight spilling across the clinic corridor in long, soft strokes. The base outside was already beginning its daily rhythm, boots hitting pavement, orders being called out, distant engines humming, but inside the treatment wing, the world moved differently. Deliberately. Quietly. As if aware that something fragile inside was still learning how to live. Riley entered the treatment room with a fresh shirt, damp hair, and the heavy exhaustion of a man who barely slept but refused to leave. Hank followed at his side, energized after a short break outside. Sable walked behind them, posture alert, ears tall, eyes scanning the room before she settled into her usual position near the doorway. Elena glanced up from her clipboard. Morning. Morning, Riley replied. She gestured toward the incubator. Our little miracle made it through another night. Riley released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since before dawn. 3 nights, he said quietly. He's surviving. More than surviving, Elena corrected gently. He's stabilizing. Riley approached the incubator and knelt beside it. The tiny puppy lay curled against the warm blanket inside, his chest rising and falling with more consistency now. His fur had been lightly trimmed in places to help with wound care, revealing tender pink skin beneath. And though he was still frighteningly thin, his body no longer sagged with the limp, weightless fragility of death. He looked, here. Present. Alive. "Hey, good morning, tough guy," Riley whispered. As if recognizing the familiar voice, the puppy lifted his head slightly. His single open eye blinked sluggishly, struggling to focus. But he tried. That effort alone nearly unraveled Riley. "You're doing amazing," Riley whispered. The pup let out a tiny, breathy whine, weak but intentional. His small paw shifted forward, dragging gently against the blanket. Hank moved beside Riley and pressed his nose softly against the incubator door. Sable stood just behind, watching with the silent vigilance that had become her constant state whenever this little survivor was involved. Elena checked the screen again. "We're going to introduce slightly thicker nutrition today. Just a small amount. His body might be ready." Riley nodded. "Tell me what to do." Elena smiled faintly. "You'll get your turn." An hour later, Camila entered with a notebook tucked under her arm and a half-empty coffee in hand. "Okay," she said, approaching the incubator, "let me see him. I heard he's doing better." Riley shifted aside so she could look. Camila gasped softly. "Oh, sweetheart, you look stronger today." Elena nodded. "He's responding to the warmth and the fluids. And Riley hasn't left his side, so that doesn't hurt either." Riley shrugged. "He shouldn't be alone." Camila met his eyes with something like gratitude. "No. He shouldn't." She opened her notebook. "I'm starting behavioral logs. Even now, trauma can shape future responses. The sooner we document, the better." "Trauma?" Riley asked. "Yes," Elena said gently. "A puppy buried alive, it may shape how he reacts to sounds, confinement, sudden changes. But we'll help him recover." Riley looked at the tiny pup again. "Whatever he needs." Around noon, Elena gave Riley a small bowl of warmed, thickened formula designed for severely malnourished pups. "You'll give him this," she said. "Slowly. Just a fingerdip at a time." Riley washed his hands, breathed deeply, and dipped his finger into the mixture. Then he carefully opened the incubator door. The puppy sniffed the air weakly. "Hey," Riley whispered. "It's okay. It's food. Just a little." He touched the formula to the pup's mouth. The pup hesitated. Then his tongue flicked. A slow lick. A swallow. Riley felt a rush of emotion hit him so hard he almost lost his breath. "That's it," he said softly. "That's perfect. You're doing so good." The puppy took another tiny lick. Then another. Slow. Careful. Determined. Elena made a quiet sound of triumph behind him. "Beautiful. Exactly what we needed." Camila smiled, tears collecting at the corners of her eyes. "He wants to live." Hank wagged his tail once. Sable's eyes softened. Riley fed the pup for nearly 15 minutes, giving only tiny amounts at a time until Elena gently stopped him. "That's enough for now. His system needs time to adjust." Riley nodded and wiped the pup's mouth gently with a cloth. The little dog let out a soft, tired sigh and curled closer into the blanket. "He's exhausted," Elena said. "But in a good way. This kind of exhaustion means progress." Riley rested his hand near the pup again, and almost immediately, the little dog nudged toward his fingers, barely, but unmistakably. "He knows you," Camila whispered. Riley swallowed hard. "Yeah. I think he does." Later, as evening fell and the sky outside turned a deep orange, Riley finally stepped out of the clinic to stretch his legs. Hank remained glued to his side, clearly unwilling to let Riley wander far. Sable walked a bit ahead, scanning the area as if guarding the perimeter. The breeze was cool, carrying the scent of creosote and distant rain. For a moment, Riley simply stood there, breathing it in. It felt like the first breath he'd taken in days that didn't hurt. Hank nudged his hand. Sable brushed against his leg. Riley knelt and wrapped an arm around each of them. You too, you knew something was wrong out there. You saved him. Hank gave a low, soft woof. Sable pressed her forehead against Riley's shoulder. Thank you, Riley whispered. They stayed like that for several quiet seconds. Then Riley stood, straightened his uniform, and walked back toward the clinic. He wasn't ready to be away from the little pup for long. He didn't think he ever would be. When he entered the treatment room, the puppy was awake again, just barely, but his eye lifted when he sensed Riley's footsteps. Riley smiled softly. Miss me? The pup gave a soft sigh. Riley reached in and rested his hand inside the incubator again. The tiny dog pressed his face against Riley's palm. And for the first time. For the very first time. Riley allowed himself to imagine a future where this pup didn't just survive. But lived. Really lived. The next morning arrived quietly, as if the desert itself understood that something fragile in the clinic needed gentleness. Soft golden light filtered through the blinds, dust particles drifting lazily in its glow. The base outside was already stirring, vehicles revving, shouted commands bouncing off concrete, but inside the treatment room, time seemed to move slower. Softer. Deliberately. Riley stepped inside with the same careful energy he'd carried for days. His face was tired, his eyes shadowed beneath lack of sleep, but his focus remained clear, the tiny life fighting from inside the incubator. Hank trotted in behind him, alert but unusually calm, as if sensing the fragility in the room. Sable padded in last, taking her place near the wall in a quiet watchful stance. Elena looked up from the monitor she was checking. Morning, she said. He's still holding steady. Riley exhaled in relief. Good. He had a bit of restlessness around 3 a.m., she added. But that's normal. His nerves are still recovering. Riley moved closer to the incubator, and the moment he leaned toward it, the puppy stirred. His head lifted, slowly, shakily, but more controlled than before. His eye blinked once, attempting to focus on the familiar silhouette. Hey there, Riley whispered. You're awake. The pup made a faint sound in response. Not a cry, more like a soft acknowledgement. Elena watched the small interaction with a smile. He definitely recognizes your voice now. Riley felt a warmth bloom inside his chest. I'm not going anywhere, he whispered to the little pup. Not today. Not any day. The tiny dog shifted, pressing his fragile body against the inner wall of the incubator, leaning toward Riley's hand. Later that morning, Elena prepared a small syringe of diluted formula. He needs more nourishment today, she said. Just a little more than yesterday. Riley nodded, ready to help. Elena handed him the syringe carefully. Go slowly. And watch his breathing. If it stutters too much, stop. Riley positioned himself beside the incubator, steadying his hand. The pup sniffed at the air as Riley leaned in with the syringe tip. That's it, Riley whispered. Just a taste. He gently let a drop touch the puppy's lips. The pup licked, weakly at first, then with a little more determination. Hank's ears perked. Sable lifted her head, tail tapping faintly against the floor. The puppy swallowed. Another drop. Another swallow. Riley felt something loosen inside his chest, a knot he hadn't realized he was holding tightly for hours. You're doing so well, he murmured, voice thick with quiet emotion. Just keep going. Elena nodded with satisfaction. Perfect. That's exactly what we needed. Riley continued feeding him slowly, pausing whenever the pup looked too tired or overwhelmed. After a few minutes, the tiny dog rested his head on Riley's fingertip, his breathing soft and steady. That's enough for now, Elena said softly. He needs to rest. Riley gently wiped the pup's mouth and placed a small towel over part of his body to preserve warmth. The puppy curled into the warmth, safe, supported, alive. By midday, the clinic saw more visitors, fellow soldiers who had heard about the rescued pup and wanted to check on him. Some stood quietly at the doorway. Others offered small donations, blankets, tiny toys, and used medical supplies. One Marine even dropped off a small handmade collar, though it was far too big for the little survivor now. Riley thanked each person with quiet sincerity, but he never stayed away from the incubator for long. Camila returned around noon, holding her behavioral notebook. "He looks brighter today," she said softly. "His expression, it's less empty. More aware." "He's fighting," Riley replied. Camila knelt near the incubator. "I want to introduce mild sensory stimulation, nothing heavy, just soft sounds. Trauma can cause disassociation. Rebuilding sensory trust can help." Riley frowned gently. "Will that stress him?" "No," Camila assured. "We'll keep it very small. Soft. Familiar." Riley realized what she was hinting at. "You want me to talk to him?" "Yes," Camila said. "Your voice is safe to him. It's something he's anchored to." Riley leaned close again, resting his hand inside the incubator the way he'd done so many times before. The pup nudged against it almost immediately. "Hey, little guy," Riley whispered. "You're doing great. You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you ever again." The small dog let out a soft, almost relieved exhale. Camila wrote something down. "Good." He responded to your tone. Riley continued speaking, quietly, softly, while the pup remained close to his hand, letting the familiar sound soothe him. The transformation was subtle, but real. In the late afternoon, Elena brought a towel-wrapped bundle to Riley. "He's warm enough. I think he's ready for a short hold again." Riley's heart leapt. "Really?" "Just a few minutes," Elena warned gently. "He's still fragile." Riley washed his hands thoroughly and then carefully lifted the puppy from the incubator. The little dog felt slightly heavier than the day before, not much, but enough that Riley noticed. The pup whimpered softly when lifted but relaxed quickly when Riley held him close to his chest. "There you go," Riley whispered. "Right here. You're okay." The tiny dog pressed his face into Riley's shirt, breathing in small, uneven puffs. Riley rested his cheek gently on the top of the pup's head, letting his steady heartbeat act as a calming pulse. Hank approached slowly, ears pinned forward, careful not to startle the fragile bundle. Sable stayed at a respectful distance but watched with unblinking attention. Elena stood nearby, arms crossed, her expression tender. "He's bonding," she said. "Deeply." Riley swallowed hard. "So am I." Elena gave a soft smile. "I think he already chose you." Riley didn't respond immediately. He just looked down at the tiny survivor cradled against his chest. "Maybe," he whispered. When he returned the pup to the incubator, the little dog let out a tiny, tired sound, half protest, half exhaustion. Riley stroked him gently with the tip of a finger. "I'll be right here," he murmured. And he stayed. Even as evening shadows lengthened across the clinic floor. Even as lights dimmed and the hallway grew quiet. Even as his own exhaustion pulled at his mind. He stayed. Because every time he whispered something soothing, the puppy's breathing steadied. Because every time his hand rested inside the incubator, the little dog inched closer. Because somehow, within days, the tiny creature had become a small, fragile piece of hope in Riley's life. And he wasn't ready to let go of that. Not now. Not ever. By the next morning, the clinic felt different, lighter somehow, as if the air itself understood that the tiny life inside the incubator had crossed another invisible threshold. The sun rose warm and golden through the blinds, washing the room in soft light. Nurses walked the hall with quieter steps, and even the steady hum of machinery seemed gentler. Riley entered the room slowly, still carrying the exhaustion of days without proper rest. But beneath the fatigue, something else simmered, something steady, something quietly growing. Hope. Sable and Hank walked in behind him, both unusually calm. Sable's tail swayed in a slow rhythm, and Hank leaned gently into Riley's leg as if to steady him for whatever came next. Elena stood beside the incubator, clipboard in hand, studying the readings. Riley's heart stopped for a beat. "How is he?" Elena turned toward him, a soft smile brightening her face. "He's improving." Riley released a breath he didn't even realize he was holding. "Improving?" "Yes," she said. "His temperature stabilized overnight. His heart rate is still delicate, but stronger. And, he's been more responsive this morning." Almost on cue, the tiny pup stirred inside the incubator. His head lifted just enough to show that he'd heard the familiar voice. Riley moved closer, kneeling beside the incubator. "Hey, little fighter," he whispered. "You awake?" The pup blinked slowly, sluggish, but alert. He shifted slightly, dragging his weak paw forward as though reaching toward Riley's hand. The movement was small. Barely noticeable to anyone who hadn't been watching him for days. But to Riley, it felt enormous. Elena said softly, "He's starting to seek contact." Riley swallowed hard. "He knows me." "He does," Elena whispered. A few minutes later, after checking all the vitals, Elena said, "I want you to try feeding him again. Today we're increasing the amount slightly." Riley sat beside the incubator, washed his hands, and prepared the formula carefully. Elena stood nearby, monitoring every step. He dipped a fingertip into the mixture and brought it to the puppy's mouth. The pup sniffed weakly. Then, lick. Another careful drop. Another swallow. Riley smiled softly. "That's it. Take your time." The puppy managed 3 small licks before pausing to breathe. Riley waited patiently, whispering encouragement until the little dog leaned forward again for more. Hank watched from beside Riley, ears perked. Sable sat tall behind them, her eyes warm and steady. After a few minutes, Elena nodded. "That's enough for now. He's processing it well." Riley wiped the pup's mouth gently. "You're getting stronger every day." The puppy let out a faint sigh and leaned into Riley's hand. Elena smiled. "He's bonding with you deeply, Corporal Maddox." Riley didn't look away from the pup. "I know." Throughout the afternoon, Riley barely left the treatment room. He sat beside the incubator, reading quietly aloud from a small book someone had left at the front desk, nothing dramatic, just soft words to fill the space with something warm. The pup slept through most of it, but occasionally he would stir, lift his head, or make that tiny breathy sound that always forced Riley to pause. At one point, Camila entered, carrying a small recording device. "What's that?" Riley asked. "I want to capture your voice for him," Camila said softly. "Just in case you ever need to step out." Consistent auditory cues help trauma survivors feel grounded. Riley hesitated. "You really think it'll help?" Camila nodded. "He trusts your voice. It's his anchor." So Riley recorded small things. "You're safe. I'm right here. You're doing amazing. You're not alone." Camila played one back quietly. The puppy shifted, his ear twitching. "That's a good response," Camila said, making a note in her log. "Very good." As dusk settled over the base, Riley stood outside for the first time in hours. The desert wind brushed across his skin, carrying the faint scent of coming rain and the distant rumble of vehicles preparing for evening rotations. Hank stuck close at his side, eyes sweeping the surroundings with practiced vigilance. Sable walked slightly ahead, her muscles taut beneath her dark coat, surveying the area like the seasoned K9 she was. Riley lifted a hand to shield his eyes from the sinking sun. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply breathe. The horizon glowed in shades of orange and gold, and the world felt strangely peaceful. Despite everything he'd seen, everything he'd lost, everything he still carried, there was a flicker inside him he hadn't felt in years. Possibility. Future. Life. He reached down and stroked Hank's head. "You found him," he whispered. "You saved him." Hank nudged his hand firmly, almost in disagreement, as if he were saying, "We all did." Sable walked back and leaned briefly against Riley's leg before returning to her steady patrol. "Yeah," Riley murmured. "We did." When he returned to the clinic, the puppy stirred inside the incubator as though sensing him come in. Elena, who had been typing notes, looked up. "He was waiting for you," she said softly. Riley smiled. "I'm here." He placed his hand inside the incubator. The pup, trembling weakly, pressed his face into Riley's palm, the effort small, but filled with intent. Riley's eyes softened. "You're so strong," he whispered. "Stronger than you know." The puppy exhaled a shaky breath and relaxed into the warmth. For a long time, Riley sat there in silence, hand inside the incubator, eyes fixed on the tiny survivor who had somehow carved a space inside his chest. He didn't think about anything else. Didn't worry about tomorrow. Didn't dwell on the past. He just stayed. Because this small life depended on him. Because this connection felt unlike anything he'd known in years. Because every breath the puppy took felt like a promise. A promise that he was choosing to live. And Riley would be there for every moment of that choice.